Hi, Andrew. How's it going?
It's going really well. You are a 2013 graduate of Middlebury College. You are now, I want to read this because it's such an impressive title. You are one of the states and regions engagement at the United Nations, FCCC, whatever those letters are, high level climate champion, of which there's only a handful in the world. And you are in Glasgow right now at COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference. Do you look at your accomplishments sometime and be like, how did I get here? Do you feel imposter syndrome when you're there?
All great questions. And I would say, first of all, there's only two actual high-level climate champions. So there's one for COP25 right now, and then another serving high-level climate champion for COP26. So COP25 was held or hosted by Chile, actually held in Madrid, but hosted by Chile. So Gonzalo Munoz is the COP25 champion, and then Nigel Topping was appointed by the UK COP presidency as the current COP26 champion. So only two actual champions, but happy to be a part of a really massive team. We call ourselves the Climate Champions team, who have been supporting them basically to integrate everything that is non-party action into the UN climate agenda. So that's basically anything that's not happening at the country, the national level, and giving it a space within this whole top apparatus. So yeah, happy to talk more about what that actually means in practice because there's a lot of really interesting moving parts to this campaign. And sometimes I like to joke again that there's two high level climate champions and like all of these low level climate hustlers sort of supporting them. But obviously, we're not. It's not necessarily how we see ourselves,
No, but I like that.
fun,
That
fun to joke
helps.
about it. Yeah,
That
but it's really a
helps.
team effort, if that makes sense.
It
Yeah, we
does,
have a
and that
really
that
big
framework of
team.
of the climate hustlers that resonates with me. That feels like it gives me a better idea of the work that you would be doing day to day out there being an advocate for the policies, the things you believe in, networking with policymakers, decision makers. Is that a fair characteristic of what a climate hustler would be?
Great question. Yeah, so it might help just to start by sort of outlining what the current climate champions have put together in terms of this framework and sort of what non-party action actually means in practice. So I say parties, what I mean by that are national governments who are signed on to the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention. So that's that long acronym that you mentioned earlier, UNFCCC. And then that basically because it's only at the national level that you can sign on to that anything that's non-party are all the other stakeholders that you can think of. So it includes some governments, and that's sort of the piece that I've been working on. So subnational governments, think at the state level, the regional level, the city level, any sort of local level government. But then also companies and businesses, as well as financial institutions, as well as educational institutions, other NGOs, nonprofits, this whole network of actors that all can take action on climate but don't necessarily have a formal role within the UNFCCC process itself. So what we're doing on the Climate Champions team is basically saying, look, the negotiations are super, super important. Obviously, we can't address climate change without action by country level governments, especially those that are the largest in the world. But at the same time, we can accelerate the pace of climate action by acting as non party stakeholders to adopt our own ambitious targets on one hand, and then also to like push that up back at parties and say, hey, we're able to go faster. Can you move faster? And it's sort of this really interesting idea that we like to call the ambition loop, where, for instance, a state might adopt a policy that's more ambitious than the national government, and then businesses react by like adopting their own business decisions based on that policy, and then suddenly it becomes possible for the national government to potentially adopt a policy that they didn't think was possible in the first place. So that's sort of the high level. And then I'd love to talk about the campaigns that the champions have developed to sort of implement that this past year. But we'll leave it there to start in case you have any
I
questions about
do. The
that.
thing that what you just described makes me think is you are at the forefront of making sure that things like COP26 are not performative. We're not just here to say we want to change things. This is what we want to do, and then you go to work to make sure that those things actually happen. They become productive results out of this ambitious goals that are set. It feels like that might be the work that you get to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I think that's a good segue to explain the Race to Zero campaign and the Race to Resilience campaign, which are sort of the two flagship campaigns that the champions have developed to make sure that among all this non-party action, it's not just greenwashing, and to make sure that it's actually substantive and making a difference in practice. So this whole apparatus for non-party action actually started back at COP21 in Paris, where they appointed the first high-level climate champion. And there were high-level climate champions for a number of years, but only last year in June 2020 did the champions really start to innovate the role and what it could mean. And that's when they launched their first campaign, which is called Race to Zero. And essentially what that is, it's a platform for any sort of non-party stakeholders to make really ambitious commitments that are in line with really ambitious and credible criteria. And we like to call it the 4 Ps, which is pledge, plan, proceed, and publish, so that they're not just saying we're going to go net zero and we have no idea how we're going to do it, but they actually have substance behind that, which is really important. But on the other hand, it also creates this really robust system for accountability going forward. So once these actors make those commitments and they get approved to join this campaign, which sort of represents like the highest level of standard of what it means to go net zero, at the same time, there's also this whole infrastructure related to that, where the public and all of the other stakeholders can track and watch their progress over time to make sure that they're actually moving forward and reducing emissions right away, rather than waiting until like the decade before 2050 to actually take action, which, as we all know, is not fast enough, because the science basically says we have to be moving this decade as soon as possible, and basically every fraction counts. So within that campaign, I mentioned this idea of what is a non-party stakeholder. And there's businesses, financial institutions. I personally have been focused on subnational states and regions. So that's any government that's one level below the national government. So in the United States, that would be state level governments, but in other countries, it really depends on what the governance system is. So, for instance, in like the UK, that would be the devolved administration. So that would be Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. In a country like Canada, that would be the provinces. In Japan, it would be prefectures. So whatever the first level under the national government is, making sure that we're trying to get as many of them as possible to make commitments in line with our criteria that I mentioned. And just to outline what that means in practice, I mentioned this idea of the 4 Ps: the pledge, plan, proceed, and publish. Basically pledging to achieve net zero emissions reductions by 2050. And then also in line with that, adopting a really ambitious near-term target out to 2030 that is in line with a 1.5-degree pathway. And what that means is basically reducing emissions to a level that will allow us to keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's more ambitious than the Paris Agreement. It was referenced in the Paris Agreement. I know this is a lot of science. Some of you may love these technical details. Some of you may not be well versed in them. So that's sort of the highest level ambition that's essentially still potentially possible based on where we are with the science. So not just the 2050 commitment, but this really like ambitious 2030. Basically, we're supposed to halve emissions by then globally in order to keep the 1.5-degree pathway alive. But then the plan piece, you have to release your plan to the public within a year of joining the campaign. Proceed, you have to take immediate action and show evidence of what you're doing right now, today, to actually reduce emissions. And then publish, you have to be willing to publish your progress at least on an annual basis going forward. Otherwise, you get kicked out of the campaign. You don't get to be a part of it going forward. So yeah, I'll leave that there for now.
That is such. First, thank you so much for working on those things. I mean, our planet needs it and our species needs it. As humans, Earth is fine. She's going to be fine no matter what happens. But as human beings, we need some of these changes to happen so that we can have safe for our families and our descendants and all that sort of stuff. So the ambitions are so mind-bogglingly big. How do you break it down when you talk to some of these organizations and governments? What is it like? How do you get them to get down to the nuts and bolts of it?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think one of the biggest challenges is sort of maintaining the really high level points while also being detailed enough to make sure that there's substance behind what you're talking about. So I've been really lucky in that the Race to Zero campaign, the way it's structured is that we have partner organizations that are essentially initiatives and networks of all these different stakeholder categories that I mentioned. So for the states and regions category, the Race to Zero partner is called the Under Two Coalition, and that's a coalition that was set up a number of years ago, basically to be this international coalition of subnational, state, and regional level governments that have made more ambitious commitments and are really dedicated to addressing climate change head on as subnational governments. So they've been really helpful in terms of getting us to be able to get in touch with a lot of the subnational governments. But I think, sticking to the high level of the criteria in themselves, and then like asking the stakeholders in practice, what does that mean for your individual locality? And within the campaign, I think, like one way to think about it is when you're setting forth the decarbonization pathway as a government, you just have to think about what sectors, what are the contributors to emissions in your particular jurisdiction, and where do they come from? Like how are you going to address emissions within each of those different sectors? So like every state and region has a different makeup of emissions in terms of their profile. So really being able to cater to like a state that might have like majority emissions from transport is very different from catering to a state that has majority emissions from deforestation, from agriculture, and sort of crop clearance and that kind of thing. So like starting on the really high level with the criteria, making sure that's really clear. And then working with partners to sort of hold the hand of governments that say, we want to join this campaign, but we need help in order to actually develop those really robust pathways going forward, and then to adopt the policies that will help us actually be able to implement them in practice.
That makes me think of Middlebury's
Mhm.
Energy 2028 initiative. It seems
Mhm.
like they said, this is what we want to do. So now we're going to
Mhm.
have a solar array that will help provide sustainable electricity. So they laid out they set the ambition. They've addressed what we need to do to go along the way. They proceed along that route by developing all of those alternative energy sources. And then in the end, it's a completely carbon zero, all sustainability energy for heat and electricity on campus. So it feels like that. Is that a fair sort of microcosm of some of this work that you're describing?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. You're going in exactly the right direction. And that's a really good example because there are universities that are also part of the campaign. And I was just thinking to check whether Middlebury has actually joined the campaign. I forgot to check. I meant to check before I did this conversation with you. So maybe I'll have to follow up afterwards and have you sort of chase up the Middlebury like administration if we're not yet
Be
part
like,
of
hey,
this
get in
studio
there.
because yeah,
You've got an
exactly.
in. Just call Kate. She can get you.
We're already working on this. But yeah, no, that's exactly how you should be thinking about it in practice. And for instance, on some of the campaigns, like the city's campaign, they've come together with it. They have a couple different partners who are working on it, and the pledge form basically lists out a menu of different options for cities to be taking right now that they pledge to make as part of the campaign. By, for example, like increasing the proportion of green spaces, phasing out internal combustion engine vehicles, adopt or like replacing all the bus routes with electric buses by a certain year. These types of commitments and thinking about what are the policy drivers within each of these sectors that can help to decarbonize. So that's sort of how it's been functioning in practice. Mhm.
And you've got another race initiative. I want to hear about that one in just a moment. But this is more of a personal question for you.
Sure.
Is
Mhm.
there was a report released earlier this year that pretty much said we're out of time. We need to do everything right now. Do you get frustrated that some of these people and the organizations that you talk to are reluctant or slower or aren't like immediately saying, yes, please, we got to do whatever we want? Why is there such resistance? And is that frustrating to you, or does it just inspire you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to think about it in terms of the context of what kind of stakeholder you're talking to, and if like there is a way to actually address what challenges they're raising, and if their challenges are legitimate in the first place. And I think like that's important because there are stakeholders out there that really would find it quite challenging to meet some of these commitments from more developed areas of the or less developed areas of the world. Sorry, excuse me, like that don't necessarily have access to the finance that they need to actually adopt some of the sectoral commitments or policies that I just mentioned. But at the same time, you have other actors, especially in the fossil fuel industry, that are really like reluctant to take any sort of action, and it's completely ridiculous that they wouldn't. And it's also like economically not beneficial to them at this point because there is so much momentum, and you have the International Energy Agency, for instance, saying that we cannot have any more fossil fuel extraction starting today. That's an agency operating on a global level that traditionally has been quite conservative So for them to come out and say that up front, obviously it's based on the science and what we need to do today. But you have businesses that are still not acting in line with that. So I think it is important to be empathetic when you're talking to an actor and really come at it with a careful judgment in terms of thinking about being solutions oriented, but then also drawing a really hard line when you're talking to someone that is not willing to take action that really should be taking action. But I think part of it as well is showing the power of possibility of having some of these test cases or proof points, in terms of having examples of stakeholders that have been able to take action and have not necessarily been hurt economically, to show that it is the idea of emissions reductions and economic growth and benefits to people. This idea of green recovery from COVID, they all go hand in hand. So when a stakeholder says, I'm wanting to do this, but I don't know how it will hurt or if it will hurt in practice, then you can point to some of these examples, and also the power of collaboration in terms of stakeholders being willing to share their best practices with one another.
I just imagine you with a bag full of laminated sheets, and someone comes up with a obstacle or an objection. You're like, "Well, here you go. Here's an example of it working exactly as I'm saying." And they're like, "Wow,
There's loads
you've
of them,
really
yeah.
opened my eyes. Let's do it." So there was the Race to Zero, and then there was another initiative that you mentioned for the Climate Champions team.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So on one hand, when you think about climate change, the one first piece that most people think about is reducing emissions, and that's generally referred to as mitigation in the speak of the UN apparatus. But then a second piece that's equally as important, if not more important than in a lot of ways, is adaptation. So there's a second campaign that's really a sibling campaign to Race to Zero that's called Race to Resilience. And what this campaign is trying to do is essentially make 4 billion people globally more resilient to the impacts of climate change as they happen in real time going forward, so that people who are the most vulnerable people in the world aren't absolutely overcome by the impacts of climate change, but the stakeholders that can and should be thinking about ahead about how to make sure that we're adapting our infrastructure, our businesses, and all of these different pieces to the impacts of climate change are actually protected ahead of time before the impacts sort of hit the ground. So I know that it's somewhat depressing to think about that in practice, in some ways, and really scary. But it's so important. And I think a difficult piece of it is it does take a lot of investment, that sometimes is difficult to get people to remember that we need to be investing in adaptation alongside mitigation as well, because otherwise we're going to reduce emissions, but have a lot of really negative, harmful impacts to people's lives on the ground. You think about the impacts of flooding, of wildfires, and all of these different events that we're starting to see more and more commonly, and what needs to happen to protect people against those as they become, unfortunately, more and more common.
How do you keep in your mind the
Mm.
fate and well-being of 4 billion people?
Well, obviously, first of all, it's a massive target, over half the world, I would think. I don't know what the current world
Yeah.
population is. I think we're still under 8 billion as far as I know. Um, but, I think, again, it's about breaking it down, and thinking about it bit by bit, piece by piece. So again, similarly to the Race to Zero campaign, have been engaging stakeholders in different categories. And I would also mention, just for the Race to Zero campaign, engaging different sectors of companies and real economy actors as well. I mentioned these different categories like transport, energy, today. So at COP26 itself, each of the days, in addition to all the negotiations that are ongoing, has been designated as a different theme day. And for instance, today is sort of water and oceans and coastal zones day for the climate champions team. So we had a couple big events sort of emphasizing the importance of, on one hand, coastal resilience, but then also, other aspects related to how water utilities can help make sure that they're not contributing to climate change while also making their infrastructure more resilient, as well, which is obviously separate from coastal flooding. So again, going back to the campaign and your actual question of breaking this down, thinking about all the different actors and what categories of actors can be taking action and what they need to be doing, as individual actors themselves. So for states and regions, one way you can do this, or as a city, a subnational government, is by having some sort of chief resilience officer, and a number of states have them now and cities as well, who's basically responsible for thinking about what needs to happen today, and out into the future to make the state or the city more resilient. And then having that sort of infrastructure and capacity built up to be able to put together a plan for implementing that in practice. Um,
That's amazing. And this last little comment I'm going to make, and then you've got a busy slate for the next 6 days. So thank you so much for taking some time. But the sound, listening to you, it's so impressive. Working at the level of not only are you talking to people who are making really big high level policy decisions, but keeping in mind the people, they're not left behind. They are ready to, so, okay, you're going to cut out these buses, but people depend on that public transportation to get around or feed their family. So let's make sure that there's a sustainable option for them before you do this other thing. And balancing those two halves of the puzzle seems like a recipe for success. How inspiring it is to talk to you about that work. I hope that you find your own heart filled with the work that you're doing for helping all of humanity.
Well, I appreciate your words, and I would say it never stops. And like I was saying earlier, every faction counts. Especially in terms of the speed that we have to move at. And I think it's important to celebrate accomplishments and successes within a campaign like this, but at the same time, never stop moving and sort of thinking about, like how can we always be increasing ambition? Certainly don't see myself from that perspective in terms of the heroism aspect. But I think, like this idea as well of collaboration, we like to call it radical collaboration on the climate champions team. And like how can all these different actors and stakeholders be motivating other actors and stakeholders to take similar action at the same level of ambition. So if you're a regional government, you can be asking all the cities within your jurisdiction to be adopting their own plans and implementing them. If you're a business, you can be talking to all the companies in your supply chain to do the same thing. So if I can leave the audience with a call to action, I think would be something along the lines of considering you like what sort of actors that I mentioned that are non-party actors in your own life do you interact with who might be able to increase their levels of ambition and like what can they be doing in line with the four criteria that I mentioned and potentially joining a campaign like this that creates the infrastructure that like even though they're building momentum and making these targets without necessarily having like a complete picture right away of what's going to take to actually implement them in practice. This whole transparency mechanism and accountability mechanism that I mentioned is really important as well. So in addition to sort of like thinking about these actors and pushing them to join a campaign like this, also thinking about as a citizen and a member of the public, what can you be doing to track this progress over time and push actors to move back faster as a citizen voice. Mm.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Yeah.
I hope you get to go visit that Eden sculpture. It looks beautiful in the photos
Yeah,
that I've
so what
seen.
you can't see is in this room behind me. I was talking about this with you before we went live. If you've seen any pictures from the media of this giant globe at the COP, that's all in the room behind me. But it's a bit too loud in there to actually be able to do this interview.
Is it super chill just to sit in one
So
of those colorful chairs and look up at the planet?
yeah. Yeah, I think it goes both ways. We've actually been having nice team meditations to keep us sane during the 2 weeks because it's definitely a marathon, not a sprint. And I would sort of end by saying as well that I really admire all the negotiators that are sort of going day in and day out because our role within this context is, putting together events and meetings and all these other different pieces that support that process. But the negotiators are really like sort of down to the wire in terms of all the work that they're doing to like put together the nitty gritty details that will support the implementation of the Paris Agreement, which, as I mentioned, talking about non-party action, but that's also so important as well. So really admire everyone who's here, except for the fossil fuel companies who aren't moving fast enough.
We'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Kate. Um, and really appreciate your work and your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Take care. It was great to talk. Cheers.
Bye.